Hello, class, and welcome back. So, for today's lecture, we're going to talk about Plato's Euthyphro. When we left off, I had introduced the origins of philosophy in the ancient Greek world and talked a little bit about the characters of Socrates and Plato in this. Keep in mind, although Socrates himself didn't write anything down, Plato talked about his teacher in this sort of dialogue format. So, in this dialogue, it's important to keep in mind why both of these characters are here, Socrates and Euthyphro. Socrates is on his way into the courthouse to defend himself from the charges of corrupting the youth and going against state religion. So very serious charges, and as we'll see, he got the death penalty for them. So it's a very dramatic setting from the standpoint of the character of Socrates. Euthyphro has his own dramatic reason for being there at the courthouse that day. Euthyphro is on his way into the courthouse to prosecute his father for murder. And I'll tell you a little bit about that case. So Euthyphro is going in to be the prosecution in this case. And it's important to point out here, both for this and for Plato's Apology, another dialogue, to understand a little bit about the Athenian justice system. A lot of the roles that our society fills with professionals, like police officers, lawyers, and judges, are being fulfilled by the citizens that are involved in this case. That's an interesting aspect of the justice system that's important to understand the context of Euthyphro's case. Euthyphro came from a wealthy family of Athens, but they had estates that were substantially out in the countryside. So they're rich landowners, and something to keep in mind about the way that the Athenian society was set up at the time is that they had slavery, as well as ordinary laborers with the high-class citizenry up at the top of the pyramid. So we've got these three different levels that are relevant to this story. Something to keep in mind about Athenian slavery and how all that worked is slaves weren't given the same treatment in ancient Athens and the city-state surrounding it, and how that slavery worked in the United States. In the United States, we had slaves that, after the first little bit, are mostly from Africa, just captured people and kept from any sort of higher learning, kept from advanced duties for fear that they'd rise up, and tons of brutality, as with most slavery. Athenian slavery was a little bit different, still quite brutal, but a lot of their slaves were prisoners taken in war, and slaves were asked to do more intellectual duties. So if you're a wealthy citizen of Athens, but illiterate and you don't want to have to learn how to read, well, you can get a slave that knows how to read, and they can be your secretary, read off your correspondence and help you answer it, that sort of thing. So kind of a different different kind of slavery than what you may be familiar with, but so there were slaves involved in this story. So Euthyphro's family, they have this estate out in the countryside, and that estate is being worked by laborers and the slaves beneath them in the hierarchy. And one day, one of the laborers that worked for Euthyphro's family got drunk and killed a slave. So that's the original crime that happened. It's a laborer killed a slave. But as I said, the roles like police officers are not filled by professionals in this society. So when Euthyphro's family has a problem on their country estate, mostly they deal with it themselves and ask for next steps from the local authority. In this case, was a religious authority. So they kind of form a posse. They arrest this laborer who killed the slave, but they didn't take proper care of him, and sent off to get instructions. And take a little while for the messenger to say, "Oh, we've got this murderer we've arrested over here on this country estate. What do you want us to do with them with respect to transferring him to prison, making sure he has a court date, and so forth?" So messenger went off to do that, but while the messenger was gone, before they got back, the murderer, the laborer who committed the murder of the slave, died. Just maybe exposure, because they weren't properly treated after they were, or cared for after they were arrested. So the laborer is now dead, the laborer who killed the slave. And who's responsible for the laborer's death? That's the question. And Euthyphro concluded that it was his father who was responsible for this death. His father was in charge of the laborer's care and upkeep. He was negligent in that duty, and the laborer died. So as a matter of justice in the law, Euthyphro concluded that what he needed to do was prosecute his father for the murder of the laborer. Now, because, once again, Athens didn't use professionals for these things, Euthyphro himself is the one who has to act as the prosecution. So if anybody's going to press this case in court, it's got to be him. Because of this non-professional nature, it's possible that if Euthyphro hadn't pursued this prosecution, nobody would have. So Euthyphro's father would have gotten away with it. Euthyphro is involved in this incredibly complicated moral and legal question. What punishment does the father deserve for failing to take care of a laborer who was pretty uncontroversially a murderer himself? So what is right? What should happen to the father is the question here. And Euthyphro decides that justice, as informed by his religion, which we'll define as piety, roughly speaking, as we'll see, getting this precise definition is tricky. Euthyphro decided that piety demanded that he prosecute his father for murder. According to the laws and everything he had been taught, if you tie somebody up and let them die when they are in your care, you're responsible morally and legally for their death. And for the sake of that justice, he decided to prosecute his father, even though there's a strong emphasis in this culture for a duty towards your family. And arguably, this is conflicting with his duty to care for his father. So it would have been very controversial, even among Euthyphro's own family, what he was doing. So, they meet on the courthouse steps, and Socrates says to Euthyphro, essentially, and he explains his situation. He's going in to defend his life against these charges, and it would be really useful for him, according to how he tells it, to understand the nature of piety. He decides, because Euthyphro seems so confident about his understanding of the notions, piety, even in this incredibly complicated moral and legal case he's involved in. Socrates says, maybe with a little bit of that Socratic irony, this put on of ignorance that Socrates is known to use, and said, well, gee, I really don't understand piety. It would be really useful for me to understand this if I'm going in to defend my life. Can you please explain this to me, you young, confident person going in to prosecute this tricky thing? And so Euthyphro starts in and tries to answer Socrates' question. What is piety? Note, this is following the Socratic method. Socrates is, in the Socratic method, he goes around and asks lots of clever people deep, searching questions about what they're supposed to know about. And he finds that they know lots of clever things that he doesn't know. When he talks to a shipwright, that person knows way more about shipbuilding than Socrates knows, that sort of thing. But note here, he's not asking about some detail of the law, the sort of thing that a lawyer would know. He's asking about a deep, fundamental philosophical principle. The idea is, if you know these principles really well, your other reasoning follows from that. So it's the foundations of somebody's knowledge and what they're doing, what they're known for doing well. And in Euthyphro's case, he's asking about piety, which is the foundation of knowing whether or not you should prosecute your father for murder in this complicated case. So Socrates asks, well, gee, you seem really confident. You seem to really know, or at least think you know, the answer to this question. Can you tell me about it? And in typical Socrates fashion, he finds that there's somebody who thinks they've got some knowledge or wisdom at the beginning of the dialogue, and at the very end finds that that you didn't really understand the issue as well as you thought at the beginning. Piety, in a general sense, something like religious morality, might, in this case, take justice into account too, because it's involving the law and punishments of courts. But we need a more precise definition in order to use it in philosophy, in order for it to really be explanatory and reveal things about this complicated moral issue that Euthyphro finds himself involved in. So Socrates is a real stickler about getting a really good definition of the word piety. because of that, Euthyphro's first attempts to answer the question aren't satisfying. Euthyphro first says, tries to use examples to show what piety is, and says, well, first he references himself. He says, you asked me what piety is. Piety is prosecuting your father for murder in this complicated court case. And, of course, that's not satisfying for Socrates. It's not something that he can apply to his own case. It doesn't help him understand piety generally. So he complains about that. He says, well, I asked for a definition, not an example. Those are different things. From that, Euthyphro, still reaching towards examples, looks for an authoritative example from the religion. It's a good move to make. Piety has an assumption of religious morality. Drawing on the authoritative stories from the religion seems like a good strategy. So Euthyphro says, well, he essentially argues it's okay for him to prosecute his father, essentially overriding his duties to his family for his duties towards piety. It's okay to prosecute his father because he's got this example in the gods. The gods sometimes opposed their own fathers. Zeus opposed and punished his father. That's how he became the head of the Greek pantheon. But Socrates once again pushes back. He says, well, this is not a good enough answer. It doesn't tell me what piety is in itself. It might give me an example of something that's pious, but examples alone can't tell you how to apply a concept. And there are various ways to number the attempts that are made to give definitions to piety, but what I consider the second attempt here is Euthyphro said, well, what's pious is what's loved by the gods, and what's impious is what is hated by them. That's the distinction he moves to make. But Socrates immediately comes up with a problem here. The problem is, under polytheism, different gods can disagree with one another. Euthyphro himself had just given an example where Zeus was opposing his father. Although it seems like what's pious is what's loved by the gods and what's impious is what's hated by them, it would also seem that something can't be both pious and impious at the same time. Those are opposites. So what happens if Zeus loves something but Hera hates it? Wouldn't that, under this definition, make it both pious and impious? And then it would be very difficult to apply anywhere, to explain why it's okay for Euthyphro to prosecute his father. What seemed like a good definition at first glance, under careful questioning and scrutiny by Socrates, is shown to be a more complicated and difficult question. At which point Socrates asks the central question of this dialogue. He asks, is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's already pious? And this is a question that sort of resounds down the ages, because it doesn't just apply to ancient Greek religion, it applies to other religions as well. Enter the term divine command theory. Divine command theory is the kind of argument that a lot of Christian scholars have amongst each other. Uh, so, uh, divine command theory is one of the sides of this dilemma, saying, is something pious because the gods love it, or the gods love it because it's already pious? Divine command theory says something is good because God or the gods love it. God in the Christian monotheistic context. So divine command theory argues that God's commands or decrees are what makes something good. And what makes something evil is because God forbids it. And that tends to run into a little bit of trouble. So either in, by the way, whether you agree with that divine command theory or agree with the alternative, either way you have serious philosophical worries that pop up, which is not to say that either side is right or wrong, but I want to expose you to the difficulties here. So the divine command theory says God's commands are what makes something good and what makes something evil. That's all. Just whether or not God said it. Which seems well and good to a lot of folks, but a lot of folks point out something that seems like a problem in it. The problem is it seems to make God's commands about ethics arbitrary. So imagine you've got two parents, one that's really good at being a parent and one that's not very good at being a parent. So you're a little kid, you need a bedtime, and your parents are deciding when you'll be going to bed. Oh, I hate those update LED pop-ups. Anyway, so imagine how your good parent would decide when your bedtime ought to be. Saying, well, the kid needs to wake up at such and such a time. They need to be well rested, which means they need a certain amount of sleep before then. If they stay up beyond X time, then they get really cranky. You can tell they need to go to sleep. And then they come up with a time based on what's good for you as their child. So you think that'd be a good way to decide when the bedtime is. Imagine the not-so-good parent. The not-so-good parent is arbitrary. They make a decision about when you need to go to bed, but it's not based on anything. It's just a whim. They say, well, you have to go to bed by 5 or whatever. I don't care about how that'll affect you or anything like that, or my duties as a parent. Just I flipped a coin or something, and it came up 5, so that's what it is. You might think, well, that's a reason that person is not as good a parent if their commands are arbitrary. You'd think a good parent would have reasons for the rules they lay down. So the worry is that if God's decrees are what makes something good or bad, then God didn't choose them to be good or bad for any obvious reason. It's just arbitrary. He did it randomly. And what if he commands us to rape and murder tomorrow? Are those things good now? If he was arbitrary in choosing them to begin with as bad, you think there's no reason why he couldn't change his mind. And this arbitrariness makes us wonder, is God really perfectly good after all? That's not a knockdown argument. There are lots of clever people who have disagreed with that interpretation of things and that objection. But I'll leave it as an exercise for you if you want to argue that. But what about the alternative? The alternative in Socrates' question is God's love something because it's already good, or God's love it because it's already pious. The divine command theory alternative that mirrors that is to say, God loves things because they're good. They're not. His commands about morality aren't arbitrary. He tells us that something is good or bad because it is already good or bad. Something about the thing itself or the logic of it that makes it good or bad. And the worry, this alternative has its own set of worries. The previous one was ultimately worried, is God perfectly good if he's arbitrary? The alternative raises the worry, is God really omnipotent if morality is beyond him? So omnipotence means he's all-powerful. And the traditional Christian story of the creation anyway, God creates everything. Everything comes from God. At first there was just God, and then he created the world and everything in it. So that story has a lot of people thinking that everything's got to come from God. Nothing is beyond God. That's what it means to say that God's omnipotent. It's the source of all of it, including, arguably, morality. So you've got to worry if that's your alternative. God loves things because they're already good. You got to worry that makes goodness something beyond and above God, something that maybe God can't change, or something that was already there when God started off, or if he never started off, it's always been there with God. That God has no power over goodness, could not command that rape and murder were good things even if he wanted to. And that raises the worry. Does that make God less than all-powerful? So once again, lots of clever people have argued about this issue. So the point is not to have you settle on this. The point is to introduce you to a complicated philosophical problem that you can think about on your own. Socrates, in this criticism, is questioning about Euthyphro's attempts at defining the word piety, hits on this very difficult and tricky philosophical question, one that people are still interested in arguing about in their own settings and their own religions. And then there's one more final attempt at defining the word piety in the dialogue. And Euthyphro's final attempt, after failing to answer the problem of the divine command theory, or its alternative, he tries another definition that will hopefully avoid that worry. He says, piety is the knowledge of how to give to or serve the gods. But Socrates has some questions about that definition also. He says, essentially, gods don't need anything, according to their religion. Be hard to imagine a religion that this wouldn't apply to, really. But if you have gods that are beyond this world, much more powerful than humans, then the question arises, why are these gods involved in human affairs anyway? What do they get out of it? Which might seem like a fairly cynical way to approach it, but you might think, well, everybody's got a little bit of laziness in us. So imagine I'm sitting on the couch, I'm watching TV, I'm enjoying the TV that I'm watching, and I just don't want to get up. maybe that's all I want to do right now is watch TV. What's going to disturb me? What's going to make me move? Do something else? Well, I might get hungry, need a snack, get bored of the TV program I'm watching, want to go do something else. I could get tired and go to bed. I could have things that I need to accomplish, and I can't accomplish them if I'm staying up all night binge watching TV. But none of those things would apply to a God. God doesn't need to eat or sleep. Doesn't if they're perfect, probably they don't get bored. So what is this knowledge of how to give to or serve the gods? How are we serving the gods if they don't need anything? How are we giving to them if they have everything they need and want? Euthyphro describes it almost like a transaction between mortals and the gods, but Socrates asks, why would they bother? What's in it for them? And that's another serious question that comes up in theology, modern theology and modern religions, wondering why the divine might be motivated to create all this or interact with the world if we've got nothing to offer. So, it's another tricky, deep philosophical question that I'm not going to answer here. And that mirrors the way that the Euthyphro ends, without a good definition of the word piety. And Euthyphro just says he's got to go, he's got court cases to attend. Socrates says, oh no, I won't get my definition of piety to use in my court case, but, maybe being a bit ironic about it. And that's the end of the dialogue. So, if you're new to philosophy, you might be thinking, what's the point? We didn't come up with a definition. But the point is not only to open up questions about some deep philosophical issues, but also to learn about Socrates' methods, what he was doing. Euthyphro is a really good example of the Socratic method. He doesn't tell Euthyphro what he thinks. He isn't led on that he's got deep and complicated thoughts about piety and justice. Doesn't let on that he's examined some of these issues beforehand. Socrates just goes in there with humility and says, I don't understand this thing. Can you explain it to me? And you note by the end of it, Euthyphro is much less confident that he knows the truth or can explain it well, that he's really got a handle on this notion of piety. And as we'll see in the next dialogue, the Socrates argues that a big part of being wise is being aware of the ways that you are ignorant, the things that you do not know, the questions that you have not successfully answered yet. And he does that just by asking people questions until they realize, they have that moment of aporia, that unpleasant sensation that says, oh, I didn't really understand this as well as I thought. The shock of ignorance, in other words, that makes learning possible. So that's what Socrates is doing, is going around irritating and shocking people with inconvenient questions until they realize their own ignorance and have the opportunity to grow further. And that's about all I wanted to talk about in the Euthyphro. See you next time.